بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'm just trying to fix the volume because it doesn't seem to be working. So just give me a couple of minutes, then we will start our second lecture. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I would like you to tell me if you think my voice is clear, so I could start with explaining the most important point in chapter 2. الصوت واضح عندكم يا شباب؟ If you can just type something in the chat box, that will be great. Okay? Just use typing. Do not use the microphone. Is my voice clear? Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So I was having a little problems with the microphone, but now it seems to be working. So today we explained the most important points in chapter 2. If you go back to the file I uploaded on Blackboard, the most important points in line 423. If you go to chapter 2, on the second page, you will find a number of questions. Okay? So let's start answering these questions together. The first thing that we need is on the first page, skip the first page in chapter 2 and move to page 30. Okay? So move to page 30. In this page we see on the bottom learner characteristics. Okay? So this basically will be the answer to the first question in chapter 2. What we need to know here is that there is a difference between adults and children when they are learning a second language. And we want to look at the different characteristics that make the process different when you are a child trying to learn the first language or the second language and when you are an adult. So I would like to open the Word file where we can see the questions, so it will make it easier for everyone to follow. Just give me a minute. Okay, so as we can see, we have these are the questions the most important questions in chapter 2. Like I said, it does not mean it's everything, but it is pretty much 90% or 85% of all the things that are important in chapter 2. So, like I said, on page 30, to answer the first question, compare between the learning characteristics الخصائص الموجودة التي تؤثر على اكتساب الأطفال للغة الأولى أو اللغة الثانية وكذلك التي تؤثر على adults. Okay, so it's different when you are a child and when you are an adult trying to learn the second language. So go down to learning characteristics. You can see the first paragraph. We need these points. So the first point is in the first paragraph. By definition, all second language learners, regardless of age, have already acquired at least one language. That's why we call it second language acquisition or learning, because they already know at least one language. So this prior knowledge may be an advantage in the sense that they have an idea of how language works. They have an idea how to learn language. They have an idea how to write, how to certain strategies to, for example, learn grammar or memorize vocabulary. So they know how languages work. This can be an advantage, of course, in the favor of adults. On the other hand, knowledge of other languages can lead learners to make incorrect guesses about how the second language works. Sometimes we overgeneralize. Okay, we are Arab learners trying to learn English, For example, I give you a simple example. In Arabic, we have the noun, then the adjective. الصفة تتبع الموصوف. So if you think that there are many similarities between Arabic and English, and this is one of them, mistakenly of course, when you come and translate, you will do it wrong. لأن في اللغة الإنجليزية we have the noun coming after the adjective, okay? We can say a beautiful house, but in Arabic we say المنزل الجميل, for example, okay? Or the red book, الكتاب الأحمر. So if we overgeneralize, sometimes we think that because we know about one language, we can apply the same rules to the second language. It can create a problem. So that's what is mentioned here in paragraph 1. Then move to paragraph 2 on the same page, under learner characteristics on page 30. Very young language learners begin the task of first language acquisition without the cognitive maturity or metalinguistic awareness that older second language learners have. When we talk about cognitive maturity or metalinguistic awareness, you will hear these two phrases many times, these two terms. We are talking about the mental processes, okay? So the ability that you have in your mind to do certain tasks, okay? To solve problems, problem-solving abilities, and all these. This is what we mean by cognitive maturity and metalinguistic awareness. Again, you will find it more in adults, not in children. So when you look at that, you might expect that adults have an advantage over children. So move on to the third paragraph. On the other hand, cognitive maturity and metalinguistic awareness allow older learners to solve problems and engage in discussions about language. Okay, هذه إحدى الادvantages اللي موجودة عند الادults. ولكن let's move to page 31. On the other hand, some researchers have suggested that the use of these cognitive skills, so valuable for many kinds of tasks, like we said, especially when we're talking about grammar and rules, can actually interfere with language acquisition. Okay, it can have a bad effect, not always being something positive or an advantage. Sometimes it can be a disadvantage. Think about the example that I gave you about the adjective and the noun in English, والصفة والموصوف في العربي. So if you overgeneralize one of the rules that applies in one language and try to use it in the second language, that will be one of the bad effects, okay? That can mean the first language is interfering with your second language learning in a bad way. At the end of the same paragraph on page 31, paragraph 1, it has been suggested that older learners draw on this their problem-solving and metalinguistic abilities precisely because they can no longer access the innate language acquisition ability. So it's not an advantage in itself, but it is the second best thing they can do. They do not have the innate ability, okay? They have already passed the age that they can learn the language with ease and fast. That's why they try to use the second best thing they can actually use, which is the cognitive abilities and the metalinguistic awareness and all these kind of things. In the next paragraph, again, in the first line, the second half of the sentence, there are also attitudinal cultural differences between children and adults. Attitudes is related to how you view others, okay? Your opinion towards, for example, the West, the Americans, the British. Sometimes if you have bad or negative attitudes, you will not want to learn their language. It will make it difficult for you to learn the language. But on the other hand, children do not have any or most of these negative attitudes. They do not think about the bad things that we think of, politics, religious differences, and so on. So sometimes, again, this can work as a barrier for adults. But children, they do not have these problems. So most children learners are willing to try to use the language even when their proficiency is quite limited. That's another thing when we talk about attitudinal and cultural differences. Children are not afraid to make mistakes. They are not afraid to participate, to communicate in the classroom, even if their language is not perfect. And they know that it's not perfect, but they still participate, make mistakes, and laugh. But adults, especially teenagers, do not want others to laugh at them. They only want to talk when they are sure that they know the language. Again, that can be a disadvantage. It means that they will not participate enough, they will not practice their language enough. So these are some of the different learning characteristics that affect children and adults. So this is the answer to question 1 under chapter 2. Let's move on to question 2. Compare again between the learning conditions affecting children and adults. تكلمنا عن learning characteristics، الأشياء اللي الصفات أو الأشياء الموجودة في داخل المتعلم واللي تختلف بين الطفل وبين الشخص البالغ. الآن نتكلم عن learning conditions. So things in the environment that are again different between children and adults. Move to page 32. We have learning conditions. Again, we need the first paragraph, the first sentence. So we have 5 or 4 differences, okay, you need to focus on. The first one is, younger learners in the informal second language learning environment are usually allowed to be silent until they are ready to speak. So no one forces them to speak. When they are ready, they will speak. But if they are not ready, they will not say anything. Compare that with an adult. We will see this later. Let's keep talking about children. The second sentence. They may also have opportunities to practice their second language in songs, games, that allow them to blend their voices with those of other children. Okay? So they do not use or learn the language only in formal situations, which is how adults learn their language, but they can learn it through songs and while playing with others. So this is the second advantage that children have. Now let's look at older learners. Older learners are often forced to speak to meet the requirement of a classroom. Okay, so someone who is learning the language in a classroom and he is an adult, he will be forced to speak, even if he's not ready, if his language is not developed yet. He will have to participate, for example, in the classroom. He will have to sit for exams. He will have to do many things that children are not forced to do. So that's again a disadvantage when it comes to adults with learning inside the classroom. But even if they're not learning inside the classroom, if they are adults, for example, living in the West and their language is still not perfect, they just moved there, they just migrated, for example, they will still need to carry out everyday tasks such as shopping, medical visits, or job interviews. Okay, so again, this puts them at a disadvantage. The second paragraph, let's look at the third difference between children and adults. Young children in informal settings are usually exposed to the second language for many hours every day. They can listen to native speakers in the playground, in school, their neighbors when they play with them, and everywhere else. But when it comes to adults, they only listen to the language for limited hours, few hours. Older learners, especially students in language classrooms, are more likely to receive only limited exposure to the second language. هذا فرق. And when we talk about exposure, we're not only talking about how many hours, but we're also talking about the quality of exposure. Exposure هو كمية تعرضهم للغة. Okay? So the quantity, we know that children listen to the language for more hours, but also there is a difference in the quality as well. So children, like we said, they listen to songs, they play with others while they are practicing the language. So in the second paragraph again, classroom learners not only spend less time in contact with the language, they also tend to be exposed to a far smaller range of discourse types. Discourse means formal, informal, language that you use inside the classroom, the language that you use with adults, the language that you use formally. Okay, so different discourses we have. But adults mainly only listen to the formal, for example. unlike children. So this again gives children another advantage. Okay. يسمع لي أشياء مختلفة، يتعلم الفورمال، الانفورمال، السونgs، الجيمز، the language they use for riddles, for storytelling, and etc. etc. In many foreign language classes, teachers switch to the student's first language for discipline or classroom management. Again, this is a disadvantage because adults need to learn the language, the second language, but unfortunately, their teachers sometimes have to switch to the first language, for example, Arabic. When they do not understand English, the teacher will have to switch to Arabic. This again limits their exposure to the second language they are trying to learn. Now, the fourth difference is in the third paragraph. Parents tend to respond to their children's language in terms of its meaning, rather than in terms of its grammatical accuracy. يركز على المعنى فقط. Okay? If you are talking to a child, you are not going to try to correct him every time he makes a mistake. As long as you understand what he is talking about, then you will be fine. You will not correct every single mistake. Okay? But for adults, most of the time, especially inside classrooms, if students make mistakes, the teacher will correct them. Okay? So this is again another difference between children and adults. That's mentioned in paragraph 3, and they also talk about other things. For example, even outside the classroom, when adults speak, for example, with native speakers and they make mistakes, the native speakers do not normally stop them when every time they make a mistake, but they keep listening. Unless they get confused, someone uses a wrong word, then they might ask you for explanation. But if you make some grammar mistakes, they tend to be more forgiving. Okay, so the only place where feedback on errors is typically present with high frequency is in the language classroom. The last difference between children and adults in paragraph 4 on the same page. In the same page, 32. In the second line, at the end of second line, exposure to modified or adapted input. Modified, changed. When you change the way you talk to make yourself more easier to understand, okay, to make yourself comprehensible or understood. The adjusted speech style called child-directed speech اللي تكلمنا عنه قبل في المحاضرة السابقة in first language acquisition has sometimes been called foreigner talk or teacher talk for adults. بالنسبة للأدلتس في شيء قريب من child-directed language learning, child-directed speech اللي تكلمنا عنه اللي قلنا أنت تتكلم مع الأطفال تتكلم عن مواضيع بسيطة تستخدم جمل قصيرة تستخدم grammar بسيط. Okay? Many characteristics we looked at in chapter 1. في شيء قريب منه اللي هو teacher talk. He tries to talk slowly. He uses simple words. So that's for adults. Okay? When the children have child-directed speech, on the other hand, adults have teacher talk inside the classroom and also foreigner talk outside the classroom. When you go and talk to a native speaker, sometimes they try to simplify, to use simple words to make it easier for you to understand. زي لما نتكلم احنا مثلا مكسر مع الهنود او الباكستانية هنا في السعودية. Okay? You do not speak with them with proper Arabic because you try to help them understand. So this is what we call foreigner talk. And inside the classroom we have teacher talk. هذه كانت مقدمة للشابتر لكن مقدمة مهمة اللي هي الفروقات بين الأطفال والكبار في تعلم اللغة والإجابة على السؤالين compare between the learning characteristics and the learning conditions. بعد كده نلاحظ أن الأسئلة تسأل عن نظريات. Chapter 2 هو عبارة عن نظريات. هو تقريبا الأصعب في مذاكرته أعانكم الله يعني لأنه يحتاج إلى فهم وحفظ كثير. let's try to answer these questions. لأنه كله عبارة عن نظريات. عندنا نظرية behaviorist, then the innatist, then Krashen's, then the information processing, connectionism, competition model, interaction, and socio-cultural perspective. مجموعة نظريات كلها تحاول شرح كيف يحصل تعلم اللغة الثانية. So on page 34, behaviorism. If you remember what we talked about in chapter 1, behaviorism, when they talk about first language acquisition, they talk about, as you can see in line 2, imitation, practice, reinforcement or feedback, and habit formation. هذه كانت نظريتهم في اكتساب اللغة الأولى. بالنسبة للغة الثانية قريبة جدا، تعتمد على mimicry and memorization. Mimicry is when you try to copy, repeat what someone else says. So line 3, Nelson Brooks and Robert Clado were two linguists who tried to apply the behaviorist perspective or behaviorism theory in second language learning. They applied it using the audio-lingual teaching approach. In line 5, you see audio-lingual. What do we mean by audio-lingual? Look at the next sentence. Classroom activities emphasize mimicry, which is repeating, like I said, and memorization, and students learn dialogues and sentences or sentence patterns by heart. زي بعض المدرسين اللي درسونا في المدارس قديما يذكر جملة أو يذكر لك مثلا يكتب لك محادثة على السبورة ويطلب منك إنك تردد، أوكي؟ تردد خلفه، ويتوقع أن الترديد هذا حيؤدي إلى تعلم اللغة. So this is called audio-lingual approach, and we will talk about it in more detail in the final chapter. Now we need to move to line 10, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. At the end of line 11 in the same paragraph on page 34, contrastive analysis hypothesis. هذه كانت برضو نتيجة لنظرية behaviorism. According to CAH, اختصارها contrastive analysis hypothesis, where the first language and the target language are similar, learners should acquire target language structure with ease. Where there are differences, learners should have difficulty. لما يكون في نقاط تشابه بين اللغتين حيكون تعلم اللغة أسهل. إذا كانت فيها فروقات كبيرة حيكون تعلم اللغة الثانية صعب بالنسبة للمتعلمين. ببساطة هذه النظرية. But, however, researchers have found that learners do not make all errors predicted by CAH. هذه النظرية تقول إذا مثلا لغتك اللي حتتعلمها إنجليزية وأنت لغتك الأساسية عربية هيكون عندك صعوبات في كذا وكذا وكذا. يتوقعت الصعوبات قبل حصولها. Okay? ولكن, however, researchers have found that learners do not make all the errors predicted by CAH. Instead, many of their actual errors are not predictable on the basis of their first language. If we take, for example, a learner who is Saudi, another one who is African, a third one who is Asian, for example, Japanese, and we look at the mistakes they make, they are very similar. مع أن لغتهم الأولى واحدة لكن يمر في نفس الصعوبات أثناء تعلمهم مثلا اللغة الإنجليزية. فهذا ضد هذه النظرية. لأنه they said that because of the first language you will make the mistakes, okay, or you will have the difficulties. But we have seen that regardless of the language, you will make similar mistakes to someone who is at your level, even if he is from another culture. Now move to page 35, line 4. All this suggests that the influence of the learner's first language may not simply be a matter of transfer of habits. ما هو بالبساطة هذه إنه إذا في أشياء متشابهة خلاص يصبح تعلم اللغة سهل، إذا في أشياء مختلفة بين اللغتين يصبح تعلم اللغة صعب. Okay? It's not only a matter of transfer of habits, but a more subtle and complex process of identifying points of similarities, then deciding whether a certain feature seems to belong to the target language or not. Okay, so you will see this in the next 3 or 4 lines in the middle of this paragraph in page 35. So they look at the two structures in the two languages, they try to analyze them, then they decide if they can generalize the rule that they learned in the first language to the second language or not, simply. So that's the answer to question 3. The behaviorist perspective تتكلم لي عن 4 النقاط اللي ذكرناها اللي هي imitation, practice, reinforcement and habit formation. هذه في النظرية في تعلم اللغة الأولى. بعد كده تذكر لنا الaudio lingual approach طريقة تعلمهم زي ما قلنا إنه عن طريق الريبيتيشن والحفظ. وتكلم لي عن contrastive analysis hypothesis. So if you talk about these things when you are answering this question, you will get a full mark. Now let's move to the next question. Explain the innatist perspective of second language acquisition. Innatist من كلمة innate اللي هي الفطرة، okay، أو الغريزة. إنه تعلم اللغة عندنا شيء غريزي. What Chomsky said in chapter 1. So Chomsky did not say anything about second language acquisition. He was only talking about first language acquisition. But other researchers, as we can see in line 6, while Chomsky did not make specific claims about the implications of this theory for second language learning, Lydia White and other linguists have argued that universal grammar offers the best perspective from which to understand second language acquisition. قالوا إن نظرية universal grammar كانت نظرية ممتازة في شرح اكتساب اللغة الأولى، فبالتالي نبغى نستخدمها في شرح اكتساب اللغة الثانية كذلك. Move to paragraph 2. Vivian Cook and others point out that even though many learners fail to achieve complete mastery of the target language, there is still a logical problem of second language acquisition. That is, we need to find an explanation for the evidence that learners eventually know more about the language than they could reasonably have learned if they had to depend entirely on the input they are exposed to. So they are against repetition. They are against the idea that you repeat everything you hear in the environment and that's how you learn the language. They say that sometimes you produce language that you did not hear before. Okay, so we need an explanation to that. And they said it is the UG, the universal grammar, and some linguists said it is the same UG that is used for first language, and others said it's a different universal grammar. That's basically, in simple words, what they said on page 35. Now move to page 36. What we need to know here is we do not need much from this either. I don't want to confuse you. Okay, so skip this and move to second language application crashens monitor module. هذه نظرية جدا مهمة. I need you to pay specific attention to this theory. Okay, زي ما قلنا تطبيق behaviorist approach كان في الaudio lingual approach اللي هي نظرية أو طريقة تدريس اللي تعتمد على الحفظ والترديد وكذا. بالنسبة لنظرية الuniversal grammar أو innatist perspective كان هذا هو تطبيقها. نظرية أخرى أطلق عليها Krashen's monitor model. Krashen is the name of a person, okay, a linguist, and he suggested that there are 5 hypotheses that explain second language acquisition. So move to the second paragraph to see the first hypothesis. He said acquisition learning hypothesis. عندنا 5 فرضيات في نظرية هذا الشخص. أول وحدة يطلق عليها acquisition learning hypothesis. من اسمها حاول زي ما قلت لكم الشابتر هذا مليء بالنظريات ف it will be confusing but you will need to memorize them. لكن حاول تستفيد من اسم النظرية لمعرفة عن ماذا تتكلم هذه النظرية. فشوف هذا الاسم مثلا acquisition learning hypothesis يتكلم عن acquisition ويتكلم عن learning. So basically what it means in line 2, we acquire as we are exposed to samples of the second language we understand in much the same way that children pick up their first language. So there are some things that we acquire, like children acquire their language. But there are other things that we learn. So with no conscious attention to language form. We learn, on the other hand, through conscious attention to form and rule learning. إذا في أشياء نكتسبها اكتساب بدون انتباه وفي أشياء يجب أننا ندرسها. Okay? Things we need to learn with conscious attention, like rules, like grammar. These things need learning. هذه النظرية الأولى. Things that we acquire and other things that we learn. The second hypothesis on page 37, the monitor hypothesis. The acquired system initiates speaker's utterance and is responsible for spontaneous language use. قلنا في أشياء نكتسبها في الفرضية الأولى وفي أشياء نتعلمها. So the things that we have acquired is what we produce when we talk, okay, spontaneously. لما نتكلم بشكل بدون ما نقعد مثلا نجهز خطاب معين أو إن we plan something in our mind. This is what the acquired system is responsible for, okay? The learned system, sometimes as we are talking, we make mistakes, okay? We make a mistake, a slip of tongue, زلة لسان, okay? Then you go to the learned system, الشيء اللي تعلمته تعلما, الجرامر rules, القواعد, وتصحح الخطأ اللي وقعت فيه, okay? So the learned system acts as an editor or monitor. من هنا أخذ اسم النظرية. A monitor making minor changes and polishing what the acquired system has produced. فلما يحصل خطأ وانت قاعد تتكلم بشكل عفوي, الجزء الثاني اللي تعلمته مش اللي اكتسبته هو اللي يمكنك من تصحيح خطأك. هذه الفرضية الثانية. The third hypothesis in the next paragraph, the natural order hypothesis. In line 2, second language acquisition unfolds in predictable sequence, or it happens in stages. Remember we said, for example, on page 3, if you look at the list that we have, the learners learn, for example, the ing, then they learn the plural, then they learn the irregular past, and after that the regular past. فعندنا steps, certain steps or a sequence. So they learn it in a sequence, even though, even if you try to teach them what is in level 4, مثلا تبى تبدأ بالأشياء اللي موجودة في level 4, تبى تعلمهم الماضي قبل ing, ما حيتعلم. Okay, this is what the theory says. The language features that are easiest to state and thus to learn are not necessarily the first to be acquired. حتى لو شرحت له هي في البداية, okay, كانت النظرية تعتبرها بسيطة. And for example, the present simple tense. When you want to form a sentence, add s to the verb. If the subject is he, she, it, or single. نظرية بسيطة. لكن so many people still make mistakes when it comes to this theory, even though it's easy to state and to teach, but learners do not acquire it simply. So they give you this as an example. The fourth hypothesis, الفرضية الرابعة في هذه النظرية, is called input hypothesis. Input إيش معناها؟ المدخلات, okay? الأشياء اللي تسمعها, الأشياء اللي تقرأها. Acquisition occurs when one is exposed to language that is comprehensible and that contains I+1. اللغة اللي تسمعها يجب أن تكون مفهومة لك. إذا أنك تقعد تسمع شيء ما أنت فاهمه ما حتستفيد. لو تسمع مليون ساعة, okay? So it needs to be comprehensible and contains I+1. I+1 هذه معناها information +1. The information that you have +1, not +10. So it will be one step ahead. Not too difficult, but it is a little bit challenging. Only one step ahead. ما ندرسك شيء فوق مستواك, لا, فوق مستواك بدرجة واحدة. لو كان أكثر من درجة ما حتتعلمه, هيكون صعب عليك. That's what we mean by the input hypothesis. So just a step beyond the level. آخر hypothesis تكلم عنها Krashen, the affective filter hypothesis. In the next paragraph, line 3. Affective filter. Affective from the word affect. Affect means emotions and feelings. So in line 4, the third, 3 and 4, the affective filter is metaphorical barrier. كأنه عندنا حاجز. Barrier that prevents learners from acquiring language even when appropriate input is available. إيش البارير هذا؟ إيش من إيش يتكون؟ Affect refers to feelings, motives, الدوافع اللي عندك لتعلم اللغة, needs, attitudes, emotional state. Okay, if you are bored, if you are always worried, okay, if you have negative feelings towards the language, you will not learn the language. That's basically what he mentioned. On the next page, we should know that Krashen's, like I said, Krashen's hypothesis, monitor model, is very important. It's one of the most influential theories in applied linguistics. So move to paragraph 2, page 38. They give you more information about Krashen's how and why it is very influential. So Krashen's ideas were very influential. move to line 4 or 5, you see communicative language teaching. Have you heard about communicative language teaching before? When you teach using discussions, group work, etc., instead of lecturing and telling people what to do. So this was a result of his theory. Also, immersion and content-based instruction. Immersion is when you learn or listen to the language, study the language for many hours a day. For example, you study زي طلاب الهندسة مثلا والطب. They study medical sciences and medicine using English. فتتطور عندهم اللغة الإنجليزية مع أنه قاعدين يطوروا معلوماتهم كذلك. This is what we call an immersion program. Content-based زي الكتب الحديثة الآن في تعليم اللغة الإنجليزية، بدل ما يركز على الجرامر يركز لك عن daily functions for example. وأثناء ما أنت قاعد تتكلم أو تتعلم المحادثة والspeaking والأشياء هذه يدخل لك شيء بسيط في الجرامر. But the main focus is the content. كذا خلصنا من النظريتين السابقة اللي هي الbehaviorist والinnatist اللي موجودة عندنا في السؤال 3 and 4، وكراشنز موديل اللي قلت لكم جدا مهمة السؤال الخامس chapter 2. بعد كذا عندنا information processing, connectionism, competition model and interaction. كل هذه النظريات تطبيقات للمدرسة الثالثة that we talked about before, the developmental perspective or the psychological perspective or the cognitive perspective. On page 38 you see the three words: current, psychological theories, cognitive, developmental perspective. كلها الثلاث الكلمات هذه تعني نفس النظرية. فإذا قلت لك the cognitive, I mean the developmental and I mean the psychological. اللي هي النظرية اللي قلنا تركز على الانتراكشن، يهمها الانتراكشن كثير. So let's move to its application. It has 4 applications, okay, 4 theories. Before we go to the applications actually, it has 3 theories. في هذه المدرسة الفكرية في تحتها 3 نظريات، وتحت ال3 النظريات هذه لها تطبيقات زي ما قلنا، كل نظرية أكيد لها تطبيق. Let's start with the 3 theories. The first one is information processing. طبعا هذه أطول نظرية, so it will be a little bit more complicated than the rest and it will need more attention. So it has 7 points, 7 important points that we need to cover. The first one is cognitive psychologists working in an information processing model of human learning and performance see second language acquisition as building up of knowledge. هذه العبارة اللي تهمنا. تعلم اللغة عندهم is building up of knowledge that can be called on automatically for speaking and understanding. You build up the knowledge gradually and in time it becomes more automatic. This is the meaning. Then line 5, learners have to pay attention at first to any aspect of the language they are trying to understand or produce. عندهم شيء مهم جدا في النظرية هذه information processing, paying attention. Okay, you need to pay attention to learn the language, even if you do not practice, as we will see later. Then the third point that is important here is in line 9. Thus, learners at the earliest stages will use most of the resources to understand the main words in a message. In that situation, they may notice the grammatical morphemes. They may not notice the grammatical morphemes attached to some words. يكون تركيز المتعلمين على المعنى، ما يركز على الجرامر كثير. Gradually, through experience and practice, information that was new becomes easier to process. And it becomes more automatic, like we said. In the next paragraph, نعطينا مثال. If we have a beginner and we have a proficient learner and we give them a reading, of course the proficient or the more advanced will take less time in reading this than the beginner. Why? Because like we said, the beginner tries to focus and pays attention to every single word. He looks at the meaning of every single word, then the grammar, then he tries to understand the main idea. But the advanced learner, it will not take him a long time. Like we said, it becomes automatic. شيء لحظي، يقرأ الكلمة خلاص عرف معناها، ينتقل الكلمة الثانية والجملة اللي بعدها، فينتهي من القراءة بشكل أسرع. So this is an example of why advanced learners take less time in reading than beginners. Then we move to paragraph 3. Note that practice needed for the development of automaticity is not something mechanical. مو شرط انك to practice the language according to this theory. Only listening, paying attention is enough. Then we move to an important name here in the 4th paragraph, Robert De Keyser in line 3. He gave us another theory under information processing. He said that most learning, including language learning, starts with declarative knowledge. This declarative knowledge in time becomes procedural knowledge. اللي هو التغير في المعلومات. زي ما قلنا في البداية تكون معلومات، تتعلم الجرامر، تركز على الأشياء، بعد كده تصبح خلاص اللغة عندك بدون تفكير. اوكي، هذا هو المقصود declarative knowledge و procedural knowledge. declarative knowledge لها اسم ثاني knowledge that، هو procedural knowledge قد تطلق عليها knowledge how. يعطينا مثال في الصفحة اللي بعدها page 40 how you try or learn how to drive a car. Okay, so first you know certain steps. First you start the car, then you check the mirrors, okay, then you press you change the gear, then you press on the fuel. عندك عدة خطوات. okay, تشغل السيارة، تنتبه للمراية، كذا كذا. لكن مع الوقت يصبح شيء اوتوماتيك، ما تنظر لهذه الستبس، تشغل السيارة وتمشي على طول. okay, so he talks about language learning the same way. مع الوقت خلاص ما حتقعد تركز على هذه الخطوات، حتنطلق في اللغة بشكل أكثر سلاسة. In the next paragraph, page 40, paragraph 2, sometimes changes in language behavior do not seem to be explainable in terms of a gradual build-up of fluency. قلنا إنه اللغة تحصل تدريجيا، لكن هنا في عندنا تعريفين مهمة. Okay, I need you to know. In line 5, we have a word called restructuring. What is restructuring? Accounts for what appears to be a sudden burst of progress when learners suddenly seem to put it all together. Okay? عندنا ظاهرة يطلق عليها restructuring. Okay? عندما بعض الناس نلاحظ أن مستواهم عادي، فجأة أصبح مستواهم جدا عالي، تغيب عن أسبوعين أو 3 أو شهر مثلا، يصبح مستوى جدا عالي بعد الإجازة. This is what we call restructuring. أحيانا ما يكون تدريجي النمو في اللغة، ولكن فجأة تنمو اللغة بشكل مفاجئ. هذه الظاهرة في اللغة يطلق عليها restructuring. أحيانا توصل لمرحلة جيدة في اللغة، بعد كذا تبدأ تتراجع، تنسى أشياء كنت تعرفها أصلا. This is what we call backsliding. Okay? You will find this in line 8 in the same paragraph. Backsliding, when a systematic aspect of a learner's language incorporates too much or wrong things. مثلا شخص زي ما قلنا يتعلم انه الماضي من فعل go is went, but then he learns the regular verbs, the regular past. زي ما قلنا يتعلم ال irregular first، بعد كده يتعلم ال regular، فيصبح يضيف ED لجميع الأفعال، مع أنه كان يعرف أنه go الماضي منها went، يصبح يقول goat for example. هذه إذا حصلت هذه الظاهرة في تعلم اللغة يطلق عليها backsliding. في عندنا نظرية أخرى مذكورة، طبعا زي ما قلت لكم الله يعينكم الشابتر هذا مليء بالنظريات، فيحتاج حفظ وذاكرة قوية، ويحتاج فهم كذلك. لكن بعد نهاية شابتر 2 حتشوفوا أنه بدأ المنهج يسهل بشكل كبير جدا. شابتر 3 و4 و5 و6 حتى. زي ما قلنا في الشابتر في صفحة 40 paragraph 3 line 2 transfer appropriate processing. نظرية هذه إيش معناها؟ Information is best retrieved in situations that are similar to those in which it was acquired. النظرية هذه تقول إنه مثلا المهارات اللي تعلمناها في situation معين نتذكرها عادة في نفس السيتويشن، في نفس الموقف. فإذا كنا في الكلاس روم نركز مثلا على تدريس الجرامر، صعب إنه في وقت الاختبار نجي ونختبر conversation and communication، نركز على مهارات التحدث والاستماع. لا، ما دام تركيزنا على الجرامر نقيس الجرامر. أو كنا في كلاس روم دائما نتكلم we use group work, we use communication, communicative language, teaching, and in the exam I give you a written exam about grammar. That's not a good idea. هذا المقصود ب transfer appropriate processing. إذا أننا مركزين على شيء معين أثناء التعلم حيكون أفضل نتيجة لقياس هذا التعلم من خلال context similar to the one we used in learning that language. That's what we need in this theory, so that's the answer to the information processing. زي ما قلنا هي أطول نظرية عندنا. بعد كذا النظريات اللي بعدها أسهل. Connectionism. من اسمها connectionism is making connections or links. As we said in paragraph or in chapter 1, when we hear something, we make connections between the word and the object in real life. And we also make connections between the words that occur together. Same ideas are discussed here. So line 4, connectionists attribute greater importance to the role of environment than any specific innate language ability. خلاص كل النظريات هذه information processing, connectionism واللي حتيجي بعدها كلهم they do not believe in the innate ability. ما يؤمنوا بكلام تشومسكي. Okay? إنه في شيء محدد في الدماغ خاص بتعلم اللغة. لا هذول يقول لك تعلم اللغة زي تعلم أي مهارة أخرى. Okay? From the environment. Arguing that what is innate is simply the ability to learn, not any specific language principles. نفس الفكرة اللي ذكرناها. Connectionists also attribute less importance to the kind of declarative knowledge. نفس الكلام. At the end of the first paragraph, Ellis 2002 explains the emphasis is on the frequency. هنا يركزوا على كم مرة تسمع هذا الشيء. كل ما سمعته أكثر قلنا you will make connections. The frequency with which learners encounter specific linguistic features in the input and the frequency in which the features occur together. زي ما قلنا كلمات اللي تجي مع بعض. Shower تأخذ I will have a shower. I cannot say I will do a shower. Okay, so if we hear these words coming together with other words, we will make connections and learn them. Paragraph 2, connectionists argue that learners gradually build up their knowledge of the language through exposure to thousands of instances of linguistic features they eventually hear. تسمع هذه العبارة لمدة آلاف المرات. He has. مستحيل انك تجي تقول he has مثلا. تعرف ان هي أخذ has. We تأخذ have مثلا. Okay? So they give you this example later on. So after hearing language features in specific situations or linguistic contexts over and over again, learners develop stronger and stronger network of connections between these elements. Eventually, the presence of one situation or linguistic element will activate the other in the learner's mind. فإذا قلنا he وتعرف إن اللي بنذكره عن saying مستحيل إنك تقول he saying or he say. هتقول he says. As you can see in the example under that, not because they know the rule, but because they have heard examples such as I say and he says. خلاص he تأخذ says I تأخذ say. Okay, so often that each subject pronoun activates the correct verb form. فالpronouns اللي تأخذ أو الverbs اللي تأخذ pronouns معينة مثال جيد على الconnectionism. بالنسبة لي الconnectionism هذا هو الكلام اللي نحتاجه فيها 3 النقاط هذه. Then we have the competition model on page 42 اللي هو إجابة على السؤال هذا السؤال. Explain the competition model theory of second language acquisition. Competition model. The competition model is closely related to the connectionist perspective. قريب من النظرية اللي تكلمنا عنها الآن. So they do not believe in the innate abilities. أول نقطة تهمنا هنا in line 6. Language acquisition that takes into account not only language form but also language meaning and language use. يركزوا على المعنى والuse. Then in the next line, both first and second language acquisition in both the first and the second language. Now the most important point, through exposure to thousands of examples of the language associated with a particular meaning, learners come to understand how to use the cues with which a language signals specific functions. مثلا في اللغة الإنجليزية لما نتكلم عن الكيوز، إيش نقصد بالكيوز؟ هذه المفاتيح اللي من خلالها تفهم اللغة. Okay? مثلا في اللغة الإنجليزية عندنا الword order نعرف إن كل جملة في اللغة الإنجليزية تبدأ بالsubject والverb وكذا والcomplement. It's what you can see in the middle of the page. SVO subject verb then object. هذا أحد أهم المفاتيح في اللغة الإنجليزية. في عندنا مفاتيح أخرى تدلنا على المعنى إذا ما كنا نعرف الكلمات كلها ونعرف المعاني. في عندنا مثلا what we used in semantics. If you have done semantics before, when you look at a word and you say, is it animate? Okay, animacy for example. هل هذه كائن حي مثلا؟ نقدر نقول the boy eat the cake, but we cannot say the cake ate the boy because cake is not animate. So we can use word order, we can use grammatical markers, we can use animacy, but the most important one in English is word order, of course. SVO. So the point that we need, خلاص بعد ما تكلمنا عن هذه النقاط الآن on page 42, we need to move to page 43 نهاية الباراجراف. According to the competition model, هذه خلاصة النظرية. Second language acquisition requires the learners to learn the relative importance of the different cues appropriate in the language they are learning. So they don't only through exposure know the cues, but they also know the most important and the relative cues. عندنا أكثر مفتاح لفهم هذه اللغة، ولكن مثلا المفتاح الأهم هو ال SVO. فالcompetition model ما يركز فقط على معرفة المفاتيح، ولكن معرفة أهم مفتاح لفهم هذه اللغة. خلصنا من الثلاث النظريات اللي تتكلم عن الcognitive أو developmental أو psychological theories. الآن تطبيقاتها، لها 4 تطبيقات. التطبيق الأول the interaction hypothesis، السؤال اللي قبل الأخير. What is the interaction hypothesis؟ طبعا برضو أطول تطبيق عندنا في عدة نقاط نحتاجها، تقريبا 7 نقاط أو 6. اللي بعدها تافهة جدا، سهلة بسيطة جدا، حتشوفوها أنها جملتين. فهذه خلينا نركز فيها الآن. page 43 the Interactionist Hypothesis line 2. They argue that conversational interaction is essential. من اسم النظرية زي ما قلنا interaction hypothesis، إذا يركزوا على interaction. So conversational interaction is an essential if not sufficient condition for second language acquisition. النقطة الثانية اللي نحتاجها in line 6 they agreed with Krashen that comprehensible input is necessary for language acquisition. However, he focused more on the question of how we can make the input easy or comprehensible. Not just say it's important and stop, but how can we make it comprehensible? He argued that modified interaction is necessary. يهمنا نعرف modified interaction. Modified زي ما قلنا you change it, you modify it to make it easier. Alright? That is, what learners need is not necessarily simplification, but rather opportunity to interact. إيش بالتحديد نقصد بالinteraction hypothesis؟ موجود عندنا في الجزء الثاني تحت الباراجراف الأول. Interaction hypothesis كأنها معادلة رياضية. عندك 1 2 3. Interaction modification makes input comprehensible. بما أن الinteraction modification تغييرنا في أسلوب الinteraction makes the input comprehensible. تصبح الأشياء اللي نسمعها مفهومة. وبما أن comprehensible input promotes acquisition leads to acquisition, therefore إذن interaction modification promotes acquisition. So you need to know this about the interaction hypothesis, very important. If I ask you about interaction hypothesis, you should know the role of modified interaction, and you should know these 3 things. بما أن interaction modification leads to make the input comprehensible. وبما أن comprehensible input promotes acquisition, إذن الأول يؤدي إلى الثالث كأنها معادلة رياضية كما قلت لكم. On page 44 they talk more about modified interaction. ما نقصد به simplification التسهيل، لكن نقصد به أشياء معينة اللي هي 1 2 3. مثلا comprehension checks. When you are talking to someone you are not sure if they understood or not, you check, did you understand? Did you understand what I mean? That's what we call comprehension check. The second one is clarification requests. قاعد يتكلم الشخص وما أنت فاهم, you can ask for clarification. Could you repeat please? The third thing is self-repetition or paraphrase. So you repeat the same information using different words. just to make sure that the other person understands. So if you use these things, you are modifying your speech, and you will make it easier for the other person to understand. Then the next paragraph, research has shown that conversational adjustment can aid comprehension. هذا اللي ذكرناه في السابق. Okay. What we need is في آخر paragraph في هذه النظرية on page 44, line 6, the comprehensible output hypothesis by Merrill Swain, 1985. She observed إيش النظرية هذه؟ When learners must produce language that their interlocutor, the person they are talking to, can understand, that's when they are most likely to see the limits of their second language ability and the need to find better ways to express their meaning. The demands of producing comprehensible input pushes the learners ahead in their development. عندما يحاول الشخص انه يتكلم مع native speaker مثلا، حيلاحظ انه عنده قصور في بعض الاشياء، فيبدأ يطور نفسه على اساس يعبر عن نفسه بشكل صحيح. اوكي، لما يلاحظ هذه الاشياء ويصبح عنده دافعية انه يتعلم، هنا يحصل التعلم. هذه نظرية ميرل سوين The Comprehensible Output Hypothesis. التطبيق الثاني لهذه النظريات اسمه The Noticing Hypothesis. ببساطة هذه النظرية من اسمها The Noticing, you cannot learn anything until you notice it. So we should make you notice the most important things in order for you to learn it. That's what we need from this theory or application. Then on page 45, input processing. برضو نظرية بسيطة في جملة واحدة نحتاجها شرحها في page 46 في الباراجراف الثاني بداية أو نهاية اللاين الأول. Learners have limited processing capacities. طبعا تتعلق بالprocessing زي ما قلنا من اسمها، حاول تخمن عن ايش تتكلم. And cannot pay attention to form and meaning at the same time. Not surprisingly, they tend to give priority to meaning. المتعلمين الجدد عندهم قصور أو عندهم limitation معين، ما يقدر يركز على المعنى وعلى الجرامر، فبالتالي يركز في بداية الأمر على المعنى and he does not pay attention to the grammar. هذه هي النظرية. Again we have processability theory، آخر تطبيق في هذه النظرية. What we need is in line 5, the sequence of the development of features of syntax and morphology was affected by how easy they were to process. So the things that are easier to process, you will learn them first and easier. Ease of processing was found to depend on a large extent on the position of these features in a sentence. Features that typically occurred at the beginning at the end of the sentence were easier to process than those in the middle. لما نشوف جملة معينة، الأشياء اللي في بداية الجملة وفي آخر الجملة هي الأسهل واللي نركز عليها أكثر فنكتسبها بشكل أسرع. فنفهم بداية الجملة وآخرها عادة and we process it easier than we process the middle part of the sentence. طيب. Okay. Okay, that's what we need in the processability theory. The last theory that we have in this chapter is called the Socio-Cultural Perspective. لها علاقة بالسوسيو والculture. Okay. واضح من اسمها كذلك نستفيد من معناها. What we need to know here is Vygotsky, الاسم هذا مهم. In the Socio-Cultural Perspective, he assumes that cognitive development, including language development, arises as a result of social interaction. Again, social interaction is very, very important in this theory. Okay, they think that the mind develops as a result of interaction. We have seen that interaction is important in the previous theories. Okay, but the difference here is that they are not just interaction is not another process that is important in language learning, but it is intertwined. That's the word they use. Very closely related to language learning. علاقة وطيدة جدا، كلهم نفس الشيء تقريبا، ما نقدر نقول إن عمليات منفصلة الانتراكشن والتعلم، لا كلها متداخلة في بعض according to this theory. Then we need to look at the end of this paragraph, paragraph 1. Learning هنا كيف يحصل التعلم؟ Learning is thought to occur when an individual interacts with an interlocutor. Interlocutor means someone you are talking to within his or her zone of proximal development. يهمنا نعرف what is the meaning of zone of proximal development. هذه مصطلح مهم أيضا لازم تعرفه، ZPD أو zone of proximal development. يحصل تعلم اللغة حينما تتعلم اللغة أو تتكلم مع شخص in this zone of proximal development. What do you mean by zone? A situation. So that is in a situation in which the learner is capable of performing at a higher level because there is support from the interlocutor. زي ما مثلا شخص قاعد يحاول يساعدك انت تتكلم معه. Okay? لما يكون السيتويشن زي كذا انك تتكلم مع شخص وهو يحاول انه he is giving you support, okay, then you will learn the language. And this situation is what we call zone of proximal development. هذا اللي نحتاجه من نظرية Socio-Cultural Perspective. إذن الباراجراف الأول صفحة 47. تطبيقها learning by talking. زي ما قلنا إنه أهم شيء عندهم الانتراكشن، تعلم اللغة and communication. So another point that is mentioned here on page 48 عندنا 3 نقاط نحتاجها فقط. زي ما قلنا ZPD كانت انك تتكلم مع native speaker والnative speaker هذا متعاون معك ويحاول انه يسهل لك خلال السيتويشن هذه تتعلم اللغة. لكن الآن مو شرط انه يقول انه مو شرط انك تتحدث مع native speaker، ممكن تتحدث مع شخص في نفس مستواك برضه حتستفيد. Traditionally the ZPD has been understood to involve an expert and a novice. Expert like a native speaker and a novice is someone who is a beginner. However, recent work has broadened the term to include novice and learner interlocutors. حتى لو خاص بنفس مستواك برضه حتستفيد. النقطة الثانية نظرية Comprehensible Output Hypothesis اللي تكلمنا عنها قبل شوية، حترجعوا لها قبل صفحتين. هنا اتطورت برضه، كان تركيزها على الانبوت في السابق، الآن أصبح تركيزها على الانتراكشن. اوكي، ففي تعريفين ذكرنا لكم. التعريف الأول قبل صفحتين لل-Comprehensible Output Hypothesis، لما تتكلم مع native speaker وتلاحظ أنه عندك بعض القصور وهذا القصور يولد فيك رغبة في التعلم، وهذا السيتويشن إذا حصل هو الدافع لك في تعلم اللغة. هذا كان التعريف الأول. التعريف الثاني هنا في نهاية الباراجراف الثاني في صفحة 48. Swain 2000 or before that, the line before that, deciding what forms were best to express their meaning. So when learners are discussing together to decide the best forms to express themselves, okay, these collaborative dialogues is what mediates language learning, and this is what leads to language learning. So the second definition here, كلمات بسيطة ممكن when learners، في البداية قلنا إنه يدفع الشخص بنفسه إنه يتعلم، هنا نقول learners together. Okay, so they get together and they try to express themselves in the best way, and they try to find the best way. These collaborative dialogues that they have is what leads to language learning. Okay, simply this is what we mean by comprehensible output hypothesis. They are trying to make their output, their speaking, their language production comprehensible, understood. So when they collaborate, learners, together to come up with the best way to express their ideas or to express themselves, this is what helps them to learn the language, and this is when language learning happens. And this is the end of chapter 2, and we have seen that we answered all the questions together. I will see you next week, and we will talk about chapter 3 and try to answer the questions together. like I said, this is the most complicated and difficult and hard chapter. أنا واضح زي ما قلت لكم كله نظريات يعتمد على فهم وحفظ وأشياء تلخبط، لكن زي ما قلنا هو أصعب chapter خلصنا الآن. الشابترز الباقية حتكون أسهل بكثير، حتلاحظ ذلك في محاضراتنا القادمة وفي أثناء دراستكم ومراجعتكم لها. All the best and I will see you next week إن شاء الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.